In the quiet, flickering light of a kerosene lamp, the world of 19th century America reveals itself not just in the grand battles of history, but in the silent, terrifying anxieties of the domestic sphere. Imagine for a moment standing in a parlor in the year 1850. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and dried lavender. Outside, the world is changing rapidly. Railroads are carving paths through mountains, and factories are beginning to hum in the north. But inside the home, time seems to obey a different, more ruthless clock. For a woman in this era, the passage of time was not measured merely in hours or minutes, but in the diminishing window of opportunity to secure her very survival. We are going to journey into the lives of those who missed that window, those who stepped off the expected path, or those who were forced off it by circumstance. We are exploring the hidden, often whispered about existence of the unmarried woman in the 1800s. To understand their story, we must first understand the weight of the silence that surrounded them. In the cultural lexicon of the 19th century, there was perhaps no word more laden with pity, scorn, and fear than the word spinster. Today, we might hear it as an archaic term, a harmless relic of the past. But to a young woman in 1830 or 1870, it was a label that marked a social death. It wasn't merely about being single, it was about being leftover. The term itself is derived from the task of spinning wool, a job often given to unmarried women in a household because they had no children to tend to, and thus their hands were free for the endless, repetitive work of the wheel. From the moment a girl turned 20, the clock began to tick louder. By 25, the whispers began. By 30, the door was considered shut. But why was this fear so pervasive? To answer this, we must look beyond romance. We often view historical marriages through the lens of Jane Austen novels or period dramas, where love is the central conflict. However, for the vast majority of women in 1800s America, marriage was a matter of economics, law, and basic human rights. Under the legal doctrine known as coverture, which America inherited from English common law, a woman's legal identity was suspended upon marriage. She became covered by her husband. She could not own property, sign contracts, or keep her own wages. Paradoxically, while this stripped wives of power, it also meant that the entire society was structured to support only married women. A husband was a woman's proxy in the world. He was her voice, her bank account, and her shield. So what happened when there was no husband? For the woman who remained single, the legal reality was a strange double-edged sword. Technically, a single woman, a femme sole, had more legal rights than her married sisters. She could own land. She could sign a contract. She could sue and be sued. She could keep the money she earned. Yet society was designed to make it nearly impossible for her to exercise these rights. The tragedy of the unmarried woman in the 1800s was not just loneliness, it was the crushing reality of dependency. Let us imagine the life of a typical spinster in a small New England town in the mid-1800s. Let's call her Clara. Clara is 28 years old. Her younger sisters have all married and moved to their own homesteads or townhouses. Clara remains in her father's house. In the eyes of her community, she has failed in her primary biological and social directive. But her life is not of leisure, far from it. An unmarried daughter was often expected to become the unpaid servant of her extended family. She was the one who stayed behind to nurse aging parents as they withered. She was the one sent for when a sister gave birth, expected to manage the household, cook the meals, and tend to the screaming newborns, only to be quietly dismissed once the crisis had passed. There was a profound sense of precariousness to this existence. Clara lived by the grace of her male relatives. As long as her father lived, she had a roof. But what happened when the patriarch died? This was the moment of true terror for the 19th century spinster. If her father passed away, the house usually went to the eldest son. Suddenly, the unmarried sister became a guest in the home of her brother and his wife. She was demoted from a daughter to a burden. Diaries from this era are filled with the melancholic entries of women trying to make themselves useful so they wouldn't be resented. They became experts at invisibility. They learned to eat less, to speak less, to mend the clothes that no one else wanted to mend, to be the shadow in the corner that kept the domestic machinery running. The term "old maid" was used to police women's behavior. It was a cautionary tale told to young girls. Be pleasant, be pretty, be compliant, or you will end up like Aunt Sarah, sleeping in the attic and living on the charity of others. But was this the only story? Was it all misery and servitude? The fascinating truth is that as the century progressed, the narrative of the unmarried woman began to fracture and change in surprising ways. The 1800s was a century of massive upheaval. The Civil War, the westward expansion, the Industrial Revolution. Each of these seismic shifts created cracks in the traditional mold, and through these cracks, unmarried women began to slip out of the shadows. Consider the impact of the Civil War. It is estimated that 750,000 men died during the conflict. In the South, specifically, an entire generation of young men was wiped out. Suddenly, there were simply not enough husbands to go around. The mathematics of marriage had broken. This demographic catastrophe forced a shift in perception. Being unmarried was no longer solely a personal failure. It was a national reality. In the post-war years, we see the rise of a new kind of woman, one who looked at her single status not as a curse, but as a necessity that could be turned into an opportunity. This is where the story moves from the parlor to the schoolhouse. If a woman could not rely on a husband for survival, she had to work. But the avenues open to her were pitifully few. In the early 1800s, the only respectable path for a middle-class woman was teaching. It was seen as an extension of mothering and therefore safe for the feminine character. However, the conditions were brutal. A female teacher in the 1840s or 50s was often paid half of what a male teacher earned, and she was often subjected to strict moral codes. She had to remain unmarried. If she married, she was fired immediately. The logic was that a married woman's duty was to her own home, not the public's children. This created a unique class of women, the career teachers. These were women who, either by choice or circumstance, dedicated their entire lives to education. They moved from town to town, boarding with local families, often sleeping in cramped quarters and eating whatever was shared with them. Yet, in this transient, difficult life, many found a taste of freedom that their married sisters never knew. They had their own money. It was a pittance, barely enough to buy fabric for a new dress or a book of poetry, but it was theirs. They traveled. They saw towns and landscapes that a housewife, tethered to a nursery and a kitchen, would only read about. But the East Coast, with its rigid social hierarchies and watchful eyes, was not the only stage for this drama. To the west, beyond the Mississippi, a different world was opening up. The American frontier is often mythologized as a land of cowboys, outlaws, and rugged individualism. We picture the Marlboro Man. But the frontier was also a place where the social rulebook of the East was rewritten by necessity. And it is here, on the dusty trails of Oregon, California, and the vast plains of the Midwest, that the story of the unmarried woman takes a turn toward the extraordinary. The West had a desperate shortage of women. In some mining camps in California during the gold rush, men outnumbered women 50 to 1. This extreme scarcity flipped the economic dynamic on its head. In Boston or Philadelphia, an unmarried woman was surplus goods. In a mining camp in Nevada, she was a rare commodity. But we aren't just talking about women looking for husbands. We are talking about women who saw the chaos of the West as a chance to build an empire of their own, without the need for a marriage license. Take, for example, the realm of domestic service. In the East, being a washerwoman or a cook was low-status drudgery. In the West, a woman who could bake biscuits or wash shirts could name her price. There are records of women in California mining camps making more money selling pies in a single week than their husbands made digging for gold in a month. This economic power was intoxicating. It allowed some women to remain single by choice simply because they could afford to do so. They didn't need a man to provide a roof. They could buy the timber and build the roof themselves. However, the journey to the West was not for the faint of heart, and for a single woman it was fraught with specific dangers. How did they even get there? A single woman traveling alone on a wagon train was viewed with suspicion. She was an anomaly. Was she running from a crime? Was she a fallen woman? To navigate this, many unmarried women attached themselves to family groups, posing as aunts or cousins, earning their passage by helping with the children and the cooking. But once they arrived, the vast open spaces offered a psychological liberation that the cramped cities of the East could not match. One of the most surprising avenues for single women in the mid to late 1800s came from an unlikely source: the railroad. As the tracks laid by the Union Pacific and others stretched across the continent, they brought with them a need for civilization. The rough and tumble eating houses at railroad stops were notorious for bad food and worse service. Enter Fred Harvey, an entrepreneur who believed that travelers in the West deserved fine dining. He created a chain of restaurants along the Santa Fe Railway. But he needed a staff that was reliable, morally upright, and efficient. He didn't hire men. He hired women. They were called the Harvey Girls. Fred Harvey's advertisement in Eastern newspapers was simple, yet it sent a shockwave through the quiet parlors where unmarried daughters sat waiting for life to begin. The ad called for young women 18 to 30 years of age, of good character, attractive and intelligent. They were promised good wages, free rail travel, and room and board. In return, they had to sign a contract pledging not to marry for 1 year. This was the birth of the Harvey Girl, a figure who would become as iconic to the West as the cowboy, yet whose story is often eclipsed by gunfights and gold rushes. For a woman labeled a spinster in Ohio or Pennsylvania, this was not just a job, it was an escape hatch. Imagine the journey of one such woman. Let's picture her boarding a train in Chicago, watching the dense forests and crowded cities fade into the endless rolling horizon of the Great Plains. She arrives at a dusty depot in New Mexico or Arizona. The heat is dry and immense, but inside the Harvey House restaurant, order prevails. She is given a uniform, a stark black dress with an immaculate white apron, starched to perfection. There is a rhythm to her days that is entirely different from the domestic drudgery of her father's home. Here she is a professional. She learns to balance trays of steaming coffee and steak while the floor vibrates from the passing locomotives. She serves railroad tycoons, rough cattlemen, and weary families with the same cool efficiency. For the first time in her life, she has financial autonomy. She sleeps in a dormitory with other women, forming a sisterhood that replaces the family she left behind. They share secrets in the dark. They explore the strange red rock landscapes on their days off, and they realize that their value is not tied to a husband, but to their competence. The civilizing influence of these women was profound. In towns where the only other establishments were saloons and brothels, the Harvey house was a sanctuary of propriety. And while the contract forbade marriage for a year, the irony is that many Harvey girls eventually found husbands among the thousands of men moving west. But the difference was that they married on their own terms, often with a nest egg of their own savings, entering the union not as dependents, but as partners who had seen the world. But the railroad did more than just employ women. It opened up the land itself. And this brings us to one of the most astonishing and overlooked chapters in American history, the single-woman homesteader. In 1862, President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act. It was a revolutionary piece of legislation that offered 160 acres of public land to anyone who could pay a small filing fee and improve the plot over 5 years. The language of the act was crucial. It did not specify gender. It was open to any head of household or anyone over the age of 21. This legal loophole was a beacon for widows and spinsters. Suddenly, a single woman could own a piece of the earth that was larger than many European principalities. Thousands of unmarried women answered this call. They were known as girl homesteaders. Picture the vastness of the Dakota Territory in the 1880s. The sky is a colossal dome of blue, pressing down on an ocean of grass that ripples in the constant wind. Here, an Eleanor stands alone on a patch of ground that is legally hers. There is no father to tell her when to plant, no husband to tell her where to build. The silence is profound, broken only by the call of a meadowlark or the distant rumble of thunder. Her first task is survival. On the treeless plains, she cannot build a log cabin. Instead, she builds a soddy. She cuts bricks from the earth itself, thick rectangles of grass and soil, held together by the tangled roots of prairie grass. She stacks them, heavy and damp, to form the walls of her home. It is back-breaking work. Her hands, perhaps once used to needlepoint or piano keys, become rough and calloused. Dirt works its way under her fingernails and stays there. But when the roof is laid, usually sod over willow branches, and she steps inside, the temperature drops. The sod house is cool in the summer and warm in the winter. It smells of deep, rich earth. It is dark, often lit only by a single window or the glow of a stove, but it is a fortress against the elements. The daily life of the single homesteader was a study in extreme resilience. She had to dig a well, often by hand, or haul water from miles away in heavy wooden buckets. She had to plow the fire breaks, strips of overturned soil around her home, to protect it from the terrifying prairie fires that could sweep across the horizon faster than a horse could gallop. She faced blizzards that could bury her small home in snowdrifts 20 feet high, forcing her to tunnel out just to feed her livestock. Yet, reading the letters and diaries of these women, we do not find only despair. We find a surprising, quiet joy. Eleanor Pruitt Stewart, a real-life homesteader in Wyoming, wrote letters to a friend that were later published. She described the deep satisfaction of plowing her own field, the beauty of the snow-capped mountains in the distance, and the freedom of riding her horse across the open range. She wrote, "I just love to experiment, to work, and to prove that I have a brain." For the spinster who had been stifled in the East, the West offered a canvas as big as the sky. There was no one to judge her if she wore men's trousers to work the field. There was no one to scold her if she sat on her doorstep and watched the stars for hours instead of mending socks. The community of homesteaders, though scattered miles apart, was tightly knit by necessity. A single woman was often looked upon with a mix of skepticism and respect by her male neighbors. They might ride over to help her raise a heavy beam or lend her a plow, but she was expected to do the bulk of the work herself. And she did. Statistics from the era show that single women actually had a higher success rate in proving up their claims, meaning they stayed the full 5 years and kept the land, than single men did. Perhaps it was because they had more to lose. If a man failed, he could drift to another town, find work in a mine or on a ranch. If a woman failed, she faced the humiliation of returning to the relatives who viewed her as a burden. However, the isolation could be crushing. The wind on the prairie was relentless. Some accounts say it drove people to madness. The prairie madness was a very real fear. For a woman living alone, days could pass without hearing a human voice. She might find herself talking to her oxen, to the chickens, or to the stove. The sound of a wagon wheel creaking in the distance would make her heart race. Was it a friend bringing mail, or a stranger with ill intent? She slept with a shotgun by her bed, a necessity in a land where the law was often days away. Yet, as the sun set over the purple hills, painting the clouds in violent shades of orange and pink, the single-woman homesteader could look out over her 160 acres and know that every fence post, every furrow in the soil, was a testament to her own will. She was building a legacy. She was not a leftover woman here. She was a creator. But while the West offered land and silence, another transformation was happening in the chaotic, smoke-filled cities of the rapidly industrializing North. Not every unmarried woman could afford a train ticket or the filing fee for land. For the vast majority of working-class women, the story of being single in the 1800s was not played out on the open plains, but in the cramping, noisy, and dangerous confines of the factory floor. The Industrial Revolution was hungry for labor, and the unmarried woman was its preferred fuel. As we leave the quiet of the sod house and travel back to the cobblestone streets of New York, Lowell, and Chicago, the air grows heavy with coal smoke. The silence of the prairie is replaced by the deafening roar of the loom and the steam engine. Here, the old maid is reimagined as the factory girl. Her life is governed not by the sun, but by the factory bell. And in these crowded cities, a different kind of struggle for survival and a different kind of independence was beginning to take shape. The textile mills of New England were the first to actively recruit young, unmarried women from the farms. They were promised cash wages, company boarding houses with cultural activities, and a chance to help their families. It sounded like a golden opportunity. Imagine stepping off a wagon onto the cobbled streets of Lowell, Massachusetts in 1845. The air here tastes different than the crisp wind of the prairie or the stale stillness of a parlor. It is thick with coal dust and the frantic energy of steam. For a young woman arriving from a quiet farm in Vermont or New Hampshire, the sheer volume of sound would have been overwhelming. The factory bell, a harsh, commanding ring, dictated the rhythm of thousands of lives. It rang before dawn to wake the workers. It rang to summon them to the looms, and it rang to release them into the dark of the evening. This was the world of the mill girl. To understand the unmarried woman in the industrial city, we must look at the boarding house. This was a unique social experiment. The factory owners, knowing that farmers would be reluctant to send their virtuous daughters into the vice of the city, built strict, corporate-owned dormitories. These were not slums, but regimented homes run by matrons, often widows of impeccable character, who enforced a strict moral code. A girl had to be in by 10 p.m. She had to attend church on Sunday. Men were not allowed past the parlor. It was a convent of industry. But within these walls, something remarkable happened. For the first time, young, single women were living together in large numbers, away from the watchful eyes of fathers and brothers. They shared bedrooms, sometimes 4 to a room, sleeping in double beds. In the few precious hours between the end of a shift and the curfew, they talked. They read books that were passed around until the pages were worn thin. They wrote poetry. In Lowell, they even published their own literary magazine, the Lowell Offering. It was a space where the factory operative asserted her intellect. They were proving that manual labor did not dull the mind. However, the reality of the mill floor was far from poetic. The workroom was a deafening cavern of noise. Hundreds of power looms clacked and slammed simultaneously, creating a din so loud that speech was impossible. Workers communicated through a complex language of hand signals and lip reading. The windows were often nailed shut, not to keep the heat in, but to keep the humidity high so the cotton threads wouldn't snap. In the summer, the heat was suffocating. The air was filled with lint, a fine white dust of cotton fibers that coated their hair, their clothes, and filled their lungs. Many women developed a chronic cough, a precursor to bisonosis, or brown lung disease, though at the time it was simply seen as a weakness of the constitution. There was also a specific chilling danger in the weaving process. To thread the shuttle, the wooden device that carried the weft thread back and forth, a weaver often had to use her mouth to suck the thread through the eye of the shuttle. This was known as the kiss of death. If one worker had tuberculosis, the bacteria could easily be passed to the next woman who used that shuttle. In this way, consumption spread silently through the ranks of the unmarried workforce. Yet, despite the danger and the grueling 12 to 14-hour days, the factory offered something the farm did not: cash. A farm girl might work from dawn to dusk, milking cows and churning butter, but she rarely saw a dollar bill. Her labor was part of the family economy. In the mill, she was paid wages. It might be $2 or $3 a week after room and board, but it was hers. She could buy a bonnet with a silk ribbon. She could send money home to pay off her father's mortgage. She could save for a future that she controlled. This economic power was a quiet revolution. It shifted the power dynamic in American families. A daughter was no longer just a mouth to feed. She was a financial asset. But not every unmarried woman in the city was a mill girl. If the factory was the engine of the North, the needle was its silent, suffering counterpart. For thousands of women, widows, spinsters who were considered too old for the mills, or immigrants flooding into New York and Boston, the only option was sewing. This was the era of the seamstress, a figure that haunted the Victorian conscience. Unlike the mill workers who had the camaraderie of the boarding house, the seamstress often worked in isolation, in a freezing attic or a damp cellar. She worked by the light of a single tallow candle, straining her eyes until they burned. She was paid by the piece, a few pennies for a shirt, a fraction of a cent for a collar. This was the sweating system. To survive, a seamstress might have to sew for 16 hours a day. The term distressed needlewoman became a stock character in newspapers, representing the ultimate vulnerability of the single woman. She was always on the precipice of starvation. If she fell ill and couldn't sew for a day, she couldn't eat. If her eyesight failed, her livelihood vanished. There was no safety net, no pension, no disability pay. Consider the layout of a tenement department in New York City's Five Points district in the 1850s. A single room might house 3 or 4 unmarried women, pooling their meager earnings to pay the rent. There is no running water. They fetch it from a pump in the courtyard that freezes in winter. The stove is fed with scraps of coal or wood gathered from the streets. In this room, the sewing never stops. Piles of unfinished garments, men's trousers, vests, rough shirts, cover every surface. The fear of the poorhouse was constant. To end up in the almshouse was to lose all dignity, to be marked as a pauper and a failure. Yet, even here, in the darkest corners of the city, we find resilience. These women formed networks of survival. They shared food. They watched each other's children, if there were any. They passed on information about which shops were hiring or which landlords were lenient. They were the invisible infrastructure of the city's garment industry, stitching the clothes that the bankers and politicians wore, while they themselves shivered in threadbare shawls. As the century progressed, a new path began to open for the unmarried woman, one that sat uncomfortably between the grueling labor of the factory and the perceived gentility of the home. This was the role of the governess. In the grand mansions of the growing upper class, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the wealthy merchants of Philadelphia, there was a high demand for educated women to teach the children. For a woman of good breeding who had fallen on hard times, perhaps her father had lost his fortune or died without leaving a will, becoming a governess was one of the few respectable options left. She could not work in a factory, that was beneath her station. She could not sew for pennies, that was for the lower classes. She had to use her mind. But the life of a governess was a study in loneliness. She lived in a strange limbo. She was not a servant. She did not eat in the kitchen with the cook and the maids, but she was not family. She did not sit in the parlor with the guests. She often ate her meals alone in her room or in the nursery. She was expected to be invisible, yet present, educated, yet servile. She had to master French, piano, drawing, and etiquette, and pass these on to children who might treat her with the same dismissal as their parents did. Imagine the psychological strain of this position. A governess was often a young woman, perhaps the same age as the eldest daughter of the house. She would watch the daughter dress for balls, receive suitors, and prepare for marriage, all the things she herself was denied by her poverty. She was a spectator at the feast of life. The novels of the time, like Jane Eyre, captured this tension perfectly, turning the poor governess into a romantic heroine. But in reality, there was rarely a Mr. Rochester waiting for her. Most governesses moved from house to house as the children grew up, their own youth fading as they raised the children of others, eventually retiring to a small room in a boarding house, living on the charity of former employers or meager savings. However, as the clouds of war began to gather in 1860, the role of the unmarried woman was about to undergo its most violent and radical transformation yet. The Civil War would shatter the domestic sphere completely. It would take the useless spinster and the fragile girl and place them in the center of a blood-soaked nightmare, demanding that they become something entirely new, the nurse. Before 1861, nursing was not a profession. It was something a mother did for her child or a wife for her husband. Professional nursing was associated with men or with nuns. But when the sheer scale of the casualties from battles like Bull Run and Antietam became clear, the military medical system collapsed. There were not enough hands to bandage the wounds. This is where the unmarried woman stepped onto the battlefield. When the first reports of the Battle of Bull Run reached the parlors of the North in 1861, the idea of a woman stepping onto a battlefield was still unthinkable. It was considered obscene. A respectable unmarried woman was shielded from the sight of blood, from the vulgarity of men in pain, and certainly from the anatomy of the male body. But as the death tolls climbed from the hundreds into the thousands, propriety collided with necessity. The Union Army needed help, and the women of America, specifically the unmarried women with time on their hands, answered the call. Enter Dorothea Dix. A formidable 60-year-old spinster from Massachusetts, she had already spent decades fighting for the rights of the mentally ill. Now she was appointed the superintendent of Army nurses. Dix was not interested in romance or gentility. She famously declared that she would only accept applicants who were plain-looking, over 30, and wore dresses of brown or black with no hoops or jewelry. She wanted women who were serious, who had nothing to prove but their competence. This was a radical departure from the image of the angel of mercy. These were women going to war. Imagine a woman like Clara Barton, a single woman working as a clerk in the U.S. Patent Office in Washington, D.C. She was 40 years old when the war broke out, well past the age of marriageability by 19th century standards. She watched the wounded soldiers arriving in the city, many of them boys she had known from her hometown in Massachusetts. They were filthy, starving, and dying of infection. Barton didn't wait for permission. She loaded a wagon with supplies she had bought with her own money and drove it straight to the front lines. The conditions she faced were horrific. At the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, Barton was so close to the fighting that a bullet tore through the sleeve of her dress and killed the man she was tending to. She didn't flinch. She worked for days without sleep, extracting bullets with a pocket knife, cooking cornmeal for starving men over open fires, and holding the hands of boys as they died. She wrote later, "I may be compelled to face danger, but never fear it. And while our soldiers can stand and fight, I can stand and feed and nurse them." For the thousands of unmarried women who served as nurses, North and South, the war was a crucible. They saw things that no sheltered Victorian woman was ever supposed to see. They saw amputation pits filled with limbs. They smelled the stench of gangrene. They heard the screams of men undergoing surgery without anesthesia. And in the midst of this carnage, they discovered a strength they didn't know they possessed. The old maid was gone. In her place stood a woman who could command respect from generals and surgeons. But the war didn't just change the women who went to the front, it changed the women who stayed behind. With the men gone, the entire economic machinery of the country had to be run by women. In the South, plantation mistresses, often widows or unmarried daughters, found themselves managing vast estates, dealing with rebellious slaves, and facing invading armies. In the North, women took jobs in munitions factories, filling cartridges with gunpowder. This was dangerous work. Explosions were common, and women were often killed or maimed. Yet they kept working. The war proved that women were capable of doing men's work, and doing it well. When the war ended in 1865, a strange phenomenon occurred. The men came home, those who survived, but the women didn't simply go back to the parlor. They had tasted independence. The surplus women problem, exacerbated by the loss of so many men, meant that a huge demographic of women would never marry. Instead of retreating into spinsterhood, they began to organize. This brings us to the rise of the new woman in the late 19th century. The term new woman was coined to describe a generation of women who were pushing against the limits of society. These were women who rode bicycles, who went to college, who demanded the right to vote. And at the forefront of this movement were the unmarried women. Freed from the duties of child-rearing and housekeeping, they poured their energy into social reform. Consider the settlement house movement. In the slums of Chicago and New York, educated unmarried women like Jane Addams and Lillian Wald established community centers to help the poor immigrants flooding into the cities. Hull House in Chicago was not just a charity, it was a fortress of female power. The women who lived and worked there were almost all single. They were sociologists, activists, and writers. They lived together in a community that resembled a college dormitory more than a traditional home. They proved that women could live fulfilling, impactful lives without a husband. Jane Addams, who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize, never married. She built a family of choice, a network of female friends and colleagues who supported each other emotionally and intellectually. This was a radical redefinition of family. In the 1890s, to be a Boston marriage, a term used to describe two women living together in a long-term domestic partnership, became a recognized, if quiet, alternative to heterosexual marriage. These relationships allowed women to have companionship and financial stability without sacrificing their autonomy to a man. But while the urban, educated woman was carving out a new identity, a different kind of struggle was happening in the deeply conservative South. The post-war South was a devastated landscape. The plantation economy was gone. The Southern belle, raised to be ornamental and helpless, suddenly found herself destitute. For the unmarried Southern woman, the situation was dire. There were few jobs, and the social stigma against women working was even stronger than in the North. Yet necessity is a brutal teacher. We see the rise of the genteel poor. Women who had once been wealthy began to take in sewing, to make jams and jellies to sell, or to teach music lessons. They did this discreetly, often hiding their labor to maintain the illusion of their status. But there was also a darker side. With so few men left, the competition for husbands became fierce. The spinster in the South was often pitied even more intensely than her northern counterpart. She was a living reminder of the lost cause, a symbol of a society that had no future. However, amidst this bleakness, some Southern women found liberation. They became writers. Authors like Kate Chopin and Ellen Glasgow began to write stories about women who were trapped in stifling marriages or who chose to remain single. They challenged the myth of the Southern lady. They showed that beneath the crinolines and the polite manners there was a simmering rage and a desire for something more. As the century turned towards 1900, the landscape for the unmarried woman had changed unrecognizably from 1800. In 1800, she was a tragedy. In 1900, she was becoming a force. The typewriter had been invented, and with it, the office. The typewriter girl became the new symbol of the working woman. Offices, once male-only domains of spittoons and cigar smoke, were now filled with the clatter of keys and the rustle of skirts. The invention of the bicycle in the 1990s also played a massive role. Susan B. Anthony famously said that the bicycle had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. Why? Because it gave a woman mobility. She didn't need a horse or a carriage, which required money and male help to harness. She could hop on her bike and go where she pleased. But you couldn't ride a bike in a corset and a heavy trailing skirt. So fashion changed. Bloomers, loose trousers gathered at the ankle appeared. The physical restrictions on women's bodies were literally being loosened. An unmarried woman on a bicycle, riding to her job at an office, living in a boarding house with her friends, was a terrifying prospect to the traditionalists. They called her unsexed. They warned that studging too hard would make women infertile, a serious medical theory of the time. They panicked that the American family was disintegrating. But the unmarried woman didn't stop. She was marching. The suffrage movement, the fight for the right to vote, was powered by single women. Susan B. Anthony herself never married. She dedicated her entire life to the cause. When asked why she never married, she said, "I never found the man who was necessary to my happiness. I was very well as I was." This was a revolutionary statement. It suggested that a woman could be complete unto herself. While the suffragettes in the East were marching in orderly lines and debating philosophy in parlors, a different breed of unmarried woman was emerging in the lawless territories of the West. Here, the rules of polite society didn't just bend, they shattered. If the new woman of the cities was defined by her education and her bicycle, the wild woman of the frontier was defined by her grit, her gun, and her absolute refusal to conform to any gender norm whatsoever. In the vast, dusty expanses of Montana and the Dakotas, survival often required a woman to become something that looked suspiciously like a man. And no one embodied this transformation more powerfully than stagecoach Mary Fields. Born a slave in Tennessee, Mary was freed after the Civil War and eventually drifted west. She was 6 feet tall, weighed 200 pounds, and smoked cheap cigars. She never married. In a land where a woman without a husband was supposed to be vulnerable, Mary was terrifying. In 1895, at the age of 60, an age when most women were knitting in rocking chairs, Mary Fields got a job delivering the United States mail. She was the second woman and the first African-American woman to work as a star route carrier. The job was brutal. It involved driving a stagecoach through fierce blizzards, across swollen rivers, and through territory infested with wolves and bandits. Mary didn't just survive, she thrived. She was known to carry a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver under her apron, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Legend has it that she once met a pack of wolves on the trail. The horses panicked and overturned the coach. Mary spent the night guarding the mail sacks, pacing back and forth in the snow with her shotgun, keeping the wolves at bay until morning. Mary Fields lived a life of complete independence. She drank whiskey in saloons with the men, the only woman allowed to do so in her town. She brawled when insulted, and she grew flowers in her garden that were the envy of the county. She died in 1914, still single, still free, a legend who had carved out a space for herself in a world that had no place for a black, unmarried woman. Then there was the enigma of Martha Jane Canary, better known as Calamity Jane. If Mary Fields was the hero of the story, Jane was its tragic drifter. Orphaned young, she roamed the mining camps of South Dakota and Wyoming, wearing men's buckskins, chewing tobacco, and spinning tall tales about her exploits as a scout for General Custer. Jane was a camp follower, a woman who lived on the fringes of the army and the mining towns. She was often homeless, struggling with alcoholism and dependent on the charity of strangers. Yet she refused the domestic life. She famously said, "I figure if a girl wants to be a legend, she should go ahead and be one." Her life was hard, often lonely, and far from the romanticized version seen in movies, but it was hers. She moved through the world like a ghost, unattached, owing nothing to anyone but the bartender. But for many women unmarried in the West, the path to survival wasn't through guns or mail routes, it was through the oldest profession. We cannot tell the true story of the 1800s without looking at the red light districts that sprang up in every boom town from Denver to San Francisco. For a woman with no family, no education, and no husband, the brothel was often the only alternative to starvation. However, within this shadowy world, there existed a hierarchy that offered a strange kind of power. At the bottom were the women in the cribs, tiny, squalid shacks where life was brutal and short. But at the top was the madam. The madam was often an unmarried woman of immense business acumen. She was a real estate mogul. In towns like Virginia City, Nevada, during the silver boom, madams like Julia Boulette were among the wealthiest residents. Julia didn't just run a brothel, she ran a salon. She was an honorary member of the local fire department. She donated heavily to their equipment. She nursed minors through typhoid fever when the respectable women of the town wouldn't touch them. When she was murdered, thousands of miners followed her funeral procession, marching behind the band as if she were a fallen general. These women operated outside the law, yet they were essential to the economy of the West. They paid fines that functioned as unofficial taxes, funding the schools and police departments that scorned them. A successful madam had financial independence that a respectable wife could only dream of. She owned her building, she kept her own books, and she answered to no man. It was a dangerous, morally complex, and often tragic life. But for a specific type of unmarried woman, it was a calculated choice to trade reputation for autonomy. But there was another, even more secretive group of unmarried women, those who disappeared entirely. We are talking about women who passed as men. The Civil War records are filled with stories of soldiers who, upon being wounded or killed, were discovered to be biologically female. It is estimated that over 400 women fought in the Civil War disguised as men. Most did it to follow a husband or brother, or simply for the pay. But some, like Albert D.J. Cashier, did it for a lifetime. Cashier was born Jenny Hodgers, an Irish immigrant. Standing only 5 feet tall, she enlisted in the 95th Illinois Infantry under the name Albert. She fought in over 40 battles, marched thousands of miles, and was never discovered. But here is the fascinating part. After the war, Albert didn't go back to being Jenny. For 50 years, he lived as a man in a small town in Illinois. He worked as a farmhand, a church janitor, and a handyman. He voted in elections long before women had the right. He collected a veteran's pension. He lived in a small one-room house, kept to himself, and was known as a quiet, eccentric bachelor. It wasn't until 1911, when he was hit by a car and broke his leg, that a doctor discovered his biological sex. The doctor agreed to keep the secret, but eventually, as Albert aged and developed dementia, he was sent to an asylum where he was forced to wear a dress again. The tragedy of Albert Cashier is profound. Here was a person who found that the only way to live a free, independent life, to work, to vote, to be left alone, was to cease being a woman in the eyes of society. This brings us to a darker, more psychological aspect of the unmarried woman's life. What happened to those who didn't fight, didn't travel west, and didn't have the fortitude to ignore the whispers? What happened to the women who stayed in the parlors and slowly unraveled? The 19th century was obsessed with female nervousness. The medical establishment, almost entirely male, viewed the female body as inherently unstable, and the unmarried woman, with her unfulfilled biological destiny, was seen as a prime candidate for a diagnosis that ruined thousands of lives: hysteria. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word for uterus, hystera. It was believed that the uterus could literally wander around the body, causing chaos, fainting, irritability, silence, or excessive talking. Anything could be a symptom. For a single woman living as a dependent in a brother's house, the stress was enormous. She had to suppress her anger, her desires, and her opinions. When this pressure cooker exploded, she was labeled hysterical. The treatments were barbaric. Doctors prescribed the rest cure, popularized by Silas Weir Mitchell. The patient was confined to bed for weeks or months. She was forbidden to read, write, sew, or even feed herself. She was force-fed a diet of milk and fatty foods to build up her blood. The idea was to reduce the woman to a childlike state of dependency, to break her will and reset her nerves. Famous writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman was prescribed this cure. She was a brilliant, independent thinker who suffered from depression. The cure nearly drove her insane. She later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a chilling horror story about a woman locked in a room by her physician husband, forbidden to work, who eventually starts seeing a woman trapped behind the pattern of the yellow wallpaper. It was a metaphor for the millions of women trapped in the domestic sphere. But there was another, even more secretive group of unmarried women, those who disappeared entirely. The asylum was not just for the mentally ill. It was a convenient dumping ground for difficult women. Records from 19th century asylums show women committed for reasons like religious excitement, suppression of menses, novel reading, and simply husband's request. An unmarried woman who argued too much, who refused to attend church, or who showed an unnatural interest in politics could be signed away by a father or brother. Once inside, her credibility was gone. Anything she said to prove her sanity was taken as proof of her madness. Yet even in the asylum, we find resistance. Elizabeth Packard was a housewife, not a spinster, but her story terrified every woman in America. Her husband committed her to an asylum because she disagreed with his religious views. She spent 3 years there. When she was released, she didn't hide. She launched a national campaign to change the lunacy laws. She wrote books, testified before legislatures, and eventually succeeded in getting laws passed that required a jury trial before a woman could be committed. As the century drew to a close, the tension between the old maid and the new woman reached a breaking point. The Victorian era was ending. Queen Victoria herself, the ultimate symbol of domesticity, though she was a monarch, died in 1901. The world was speeding up. Telephones were ringing in hallways. Electric lights were banishing the shadows where the ghosts of the past lingered. And in this brave new world, the unmarried woman was about to find her most powerful voice yet. She was about to pick up a pen. In the quiet corners of New England attics and the bustling editorial offices of New York, a revolution was taking place. It was a revolution fought not with guns, but with ink. For the unmarried woman of the 19th century, writing was one of the few respectable ways to earn a living without leaving the domestic sphere. A woman could sit at a small desk in her father's house, ostensibly writing letters or journaling, while in reality she was constructing entire worlds where she, not a husband, was the architect. Consider the life of Louisa May Alcott. To the world, she was the dutiful daughter of the transcendentalist philosopher Bronson Alcott. She remained unmarried her entire life. In her most famous novel, Little Women, the character of Jo March, independent, tomboyish, and fiercely devoted to her writing, is a semi-autobiographical portrait. But the real Louisa was far more complex and far more desperate than Jo. Her father was brilliant, but utterly incapable of earning money. The Alcott family lived in genteel poverty, often moving from house to house, relying on the charity of friends like Ralph Waldo Emerson. Louisa realized early on that if her family was to eat, she had to work. She tried teaching, she tried sewing, she even went out to service as a domestic helper for a time. But it was her blood and thunder stories, sensational thrillers written under a pseudonym, that paid the bills. She wrote about drug addiction, revenge, and cross-dressing spies. She wrote late into the night, suffering from cramps in her hand and vertigo from fatigue. When she finally wrote Little Women at the request of her publisher, she did it for money, not art. She found the girl's story boring, yet when it became a massive success, she did something extraordinary. She'd kept the copyright. Because she was unmarried, Louisa May Alcott was a legal entity unto herself. She negotiated her own contracts. She invested her own money. She became a wealthy woman who paid off her family's debts and ensured her sisters were cared for. She famously said, "I'd rather be a free spinster and paddle my own canoe." She saw marriage not as a romantic ideal, but as a potential trap that would strip her of her hard-earned autonomy. In a world where a husband legally owned his wife's earnings, Louisa's singlehood was a calculated business decision. Then there was the ghost of Amherst, Emily Dickinson. If Alcott was the public face of the literary spinster, Dickinson was its private soul. She is often portrayed as a tragic recluse, a woman who dressed entirely in white and refused to leave her father's house for the last decades of her life. But this view misses the profound power of her choice. By retreating from the world, Dickinson created a space where she, absolute monarch. In the 19th century, a woman's life was constantly interrupted by callers, by household duties, by the needs of children and husbands. Dickinson simply said no. She withdrew to her bedroom, a room with a small writing table and a window overlooking the garden. There, in the silence she so fiercely guarded, she wrote nearly 1,800 poems. These were not the sentimental verses expected of a lady poet. They were jagged, modern, and startlingly bold explorations of death, immortality, and the self. She wrote, "The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door." By remaining unmarried, Dickinson avoided the coverture laws that would have submerged her identity. She remained Emily Dickinson until the day she died. Her isolation was not a prison, it was a fortress of creativity. But for women who craved connection rather than solitude, the late 19th century offered a new kind of social structure: the Women's Club. It started innocently enough. In 1868, a group of professional women in New York City, including the journalist Jane Cunningham Crowley, were denied entry to a dinner honoring Charles Dickens because they were women. Outraged, they formed their own club, Cirrhosis. Its motto was the unity of womanhood. This sparked a wildfire. Across the country, in small towns and big cities, unmarried women, and many married ones with free time, began to organize. These were not just tea parties, they were training grounds for political activism. They called it municipal housekeeping. The logic was brilliant. If a woman's place is in the home, then the community is just a larger home. Therefore, it is a woman's duty to clean up the streets, improve the schools, and ensure the safety of the food and water supply. Under this banner, unmarried women who had no children of their own became the mothers of their cities. Leading this charge was the formidable Frances Willard. As the president of the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, she commanded an army of women that was larger and better organized than the U.S. Army at the time. Willard, a spinster who lived with her mother and later with her close female companion, Lady Henry Somerset, coined the phrase, "do everything." She urged women to fight for labor laws, prison reform, and suffrage. She rode a bicycle, which she named Gladys, in her 50s to prove that women could master technology. Willard's personal life brings us to a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of 19th century history, the Boston marriage. We touched on this briefly before, but it deserves a deeper look. In an era before the concept of lesbian or gay identity was widely understood or named, intense romantic friendships between women were common and accepted. They were seen as pure spiritual unions. Two unmarried women living together, sharing a household and a life, were often referred to as being in a Boston marriage, so named because it was common among the educated women of New England. These relationships offered a solution to the spinster problem. A woman didn't have to be alone. She could have a partner, a beloved friend, with whom she could share expenses, travel, and emotional intimacy. Henry James's sister, Alice James, lived in such a partnership with Catherine Loring. The two were inseparable. When Alice was dying, it was Catherine who held her, who administered her medicine, and who managed her affairs. These unions were a quiet subversion of the patriarchal order. They proved that women could find fulfillment and stability in each other, completely bypassing the need for men. However, as the century drew to a close, a shadow began to fall over these relationships. The rise of sexology, the scientific study of sex, began to categorize and pathologize these bonds. What was once seen as a noble romantic friendship was now scrutinized as inverted or abnormal. This shift in medical and public opinion would eventually force many women back into the closet, but for a brief golden period in the late 1800s, the Boston marriage was a sanctuary. While the educated elite were forming clubs and partnerships, the working-class single woman was facing a new kind of challenge, the rise of the department store. In the 1880s and 90s, giant retail palaces like Macy's in New York and Marshall Field's in Chicago transformed the urban landscape. They needed an army of clerks. This was a step up from the factory. A shop girl didn't have to ruin her lungs with cotton dust. She worked in a clean, well-lit environment, surrounded by luxury goods. But the job came with a cruel catch. She was expected to dress and act like a lady, to be the face of middle-class respectability, yet she was paid starvation wages. Employers justified these low wages with the pin money myth. They argued that women didn't need a living wage because they were just working for pin money, extra cash for trinkets, while being supported by a father or husband. For the thousands of single women who had no one to support them, this myth was a death sentence. They lived in tiny, unheated rooms, skipping meals to afford the mandatory black dress and white collar required for work. This economic desperation led to a moral panic. Newspapers were filled with sensational stories about the white slave trade, alleging that innocent shop girls were being tricked or coerced into prostitution. While often exaggerated, the fear was rooted in a real economic vulnerability. A shop girl who lost her job on a Friday might be on the street by Monday. Yet the department store also offered a strange kind of freedom. It was a public space where women could roam freely without a chaperone. It was a world of female desire and female commerce. The counter jumper, the girl behind the counter, became a figure of urban sophistication. She knew the latest fashions. She navigated the electric city with confidence. She was the precursor to the modern career woman. And as these women walked home from work, navigating the gas-lit streets, they were walking on pavement that was slowly, legally, shifting beneath their feet. Throughout the late 19th century, states began passing the Married Women's Property Acts. These laws dismantled the old system of coverture. Finally, a married woman could own property. Paradoxically, this made the unmarried state less unique legally, but it also signaled a massive cultural shift. The femme soul was no longer an anomaly. She was the model for a new kind of citizen. As we approach the year 1000, we must look at one final, explosive development that would change the face of the American West and the American woman forever. The Klondike Gold Rush. In 1896, gold was discovered in the Yukon. The news triggered a stampede. Over 100,000 people set off for the frozen north, and among them were thousands of single women. They weren't just going as entertainers or cooks, they were going as prospectors.
The Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 was a fever dream, a desperate, hysterical dash for wealth in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. And in the middle of this frozen chaos, the unmarried woman found a peculiar kind of equality. The Yukon didn't care about your marital status. It cared only if you could survive the cold. Thousands of single women boarded steamers in Seattle and San Francisco, heading north not just to find husbands, but to find gold. Take the story of Belinda Mulrooney. She arrived in Dawson City with nothing but her wits and a load of silk underwear and hot water bottles she had bought on credit. She sold them for a 500% profit before she even left the beach. Belinda didn't dig for gold, she mined the miners. She built a hotel, the Fairchild, out of scrap lumber and packing crates. It was the finest establishment in the Klondike, serving champagne and oysters flown in on sleds. By the time she was 26, Belinda was the richest woman in the Yukon. She never married during the rush. She didn't need a protector. She carried a revolver and managed her own affairs with a ruthlessness that made men step aside. Then there were women like Martha Black, a wealthy Chicago socialite who
who left her husband and trekked over the Chilkoot Pass while pregnant. She climbed the Golden Staircase, a terrifying, ice-covered slope carved into the mountain, wearing a long Victorian skirt. When she reached the top, she didn't turn back. She staked her own claims, ran a sawmill, and eventually became the second woman ever elected to the Canadian House of Commons. For women like Martha and Belinda, the Klondike was the ultimate proving ground. The harshness of the environment stripped away the delicate social constructs of the East. A woman in a corset couldn't hike the Chilkoot. A woman who couldn't swing an axe froze to death. Survival was the great equalizer. But as the century turned, the image of the American woman was changing back in the cities, too. The new woman was no longer just a political radical or a frontier survivor. She was becoming a cultural icon. Enter the Gibson Girl. Created by the illustrator Charles Dana Gibson in the 1890s, the Gibson Girl was the ideal of feminine beauty at the turn of the century. She was tall, athletic, and confident. She wore her hair piled high on her head in a loose, voluminous style known as the pompadour. Her waist was tiny, cinched by a corset, but her skirts were simpler, allowing for movement. Most importantly, she was often depicted as single. She was shown playing tennis, riding a bicycle, or driving a car, activities that required independence and physical strength. She was beautiful, yes, but she was also self-possessed. She looked the viewer in the eye. The Gibson Girl was the visual representation of the shift from the frail Victorian invalid to the modern, active woman. This shift was mirrored in the world of sports. The 1890s saw an explosion of female athleticism. Tennis, golf, and archery became acceptable pastimes for ladies. But the bicycle was the true liberator. As we noted earlier, the bicycle craze of the 1890s gave women mobility. It also gave them a new kind of social freedom. A young woman could now go for a ride with a young man without a chaperone, pedaling away from the watchful eyes of her parents. This wheeling courtship was revolutionary. It allowed young people to get to know each other as individuals rather than as pawns in a family alliance. But perhaps the most profound change for the unmarried woman came not from the goldfields or the tennis courts, but from a small machine with a keyboard, the typewriter. Before the 1870s, office work was a male domain. Clerks were men who wrote out ledgers and letters in hand in copperplate script. The atmosphere was often rough, filled with tobacco smoke and spittoons. But the invention of the typewriter changed everything. It required dexterity, patience, and a certain kind of feminine touch, or so the marketing went. The Remington Typewriter Company specifically targeted women, advertising their machines as easy enough for a girl to use.
Suddenly, the typewriter girl became a stock character in American culture. She was young, usually single, and often depicted as plucky and independent. The office became a new frontier. For the first time, a woman could work in a respectable, white-collar environment alongside men who were not her relatives. This proximity caused a fair amount of anxiety. Would the office corrupt her morals? Would she distract the men? To mitigate this, offices developed strict codes of conduct. Women were often segregated into typing pools, large rooms where they sat in rows, clacking away under the supervision of a matron. They had separate entrances and separate lunch hours. Despite these restrictions, the office job was a lifeline. It paid better than factory work or domestic service.
It was cleaner and safer, and it offered a path to the middle class for daughters of immigrants and farmers. A girl who could type and take shorthand, a skill known as stenography, could support herself. She didn't have to marry the first man who asked. She could wait. She could be choosy. Or she could choose not to marry at all. The career woman was born in the clatter of the typewriter keys. However, this new independence came with a price. The bachelor girl, as she was sometimes called, lived a precarious existence. In cities like New York and Chicago, finding safe, affordable housing was a constant struggle. Boarding houses were often grim, with strict rules and prying landladies. A single woman living alone in an apartment was viewed with suspicion. Was she a kept woman? To combat this, organizations like the Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA, built large residences specifically for working women. These were safe havens, offering clean rooms, hot meals, and a community of peers. They also offered classes in everything from bookkeeping to calisthenics, further empowering their residents. But one of the women who didn't fit into the neat boxes of teacher, nurse, or secretary? What of the artists, the bohemians, the women who wanted to live entirely outside the lines? In the winding streets of Greenwich Village in New York and the Latin Quarter in Paris, where many American women flocked, a counterculture was blooming. Here, unmarried women cut their hair short, a shocking act of rebellion. They wore artistic, loose-fitting clothes that rejected the corset. They smoked cigarettes in public. They lived in studios, painting, sculpting, and writing, often in poverty, but with a fierce dedication to their art. One such woman was the sculptor Edmonia Lewis. Born to a Haitian father and a Native American mother, Lewis faced the double burden of racism and sexism. She attended Oberlin College, one of the few colleges that admitted women and African Americans, but was accused of poisoning two white classmates, a baseless charge that led to her being beaten by a mob. She fled to Boston and then to Rome, Italy. In Rome, she joined a circle of expatriate female artists, many of whom were unmarried and lived together in what Henry James called a white Marmorian flock. Lewis refused to let anyone help her with her work, fearing that critics would attribute her success to a man. She carved massive marble statues herself, hacking away at the stone with a strength that belied her small frame. She never married. Her art was her life, her husband, and her child. The late 19th century also saw the rise of the new woman in journalism. Nellie Bly, born Elizabeth Cochran, was the most famous of these stunt girls. In 1887, she faked insanity to get committed to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island in New York. She spent 10 terrifying days inside, documenting the abuse, the icy baths, and the rotten food. Her expose, 10 Days in a Madhouse, launched her career and led to massive reforms. Nellie Bly didn't just write about the news, she was the news. She traveled around the world in 72 days, beating the fictional record of Phileas Fogg. She was a celebrity, a daredevil, and a single woman who commanded a man's salary. She eventually married a millionaire at age 31, but her most iconic work was done as a single woman, fearless and alone. As the clock ticked toward midnight on December 31st, 1999, the American woman stood at a crossroads. The 19th century had been a long, hard journey, from the silence of the parlor to the noise of the factory, the blood of the battlefield, and the open sky of the prairie. The old maid had been transformed. She was no longer just a figure of pity. She was a teacher, a nurse, a homesteader, a writer, a doctor, an artist. She had proven that a woman's worth was not determined by her relation to a man, but by her contribution to the world. But the fight was far from over. The new century would bring the final battle for the vote, the horror of the Great War, and the roaring freedom of the Jazz Age. The unmarried woman of the 1900s would stand on the shoulders of the spinsters of the 1800s, the aunts who stayed home, the sisters who went west, the girls who typed and stitched and wrote. While the newspapers of the late 19th century were busy debating the new woman and her bicycle, the daily reality for most unmarried women remained grounded in a much older, more demanding rhythm, the rhythm of the household. To truly understand their lives, we must step away from the podiums and the gold fields and enter the kitchen on a Monday morning. In the 1800s, Monday was universally known as Blue Monday. It was wash day. For a single woman living in her brother's house, or a domestic servant, or a woman living alone in a soddy, laundry was not a chore, it was a battle. There were no machines. Water had to be pumped by hand from a well or hauled from a creek in heavy wooden buckets. A standard wash required about 50 gallons of water. Imagine the physical strength required just to move that weight. The water then had to be heated on a wood-burning stove, which meant chopping wood and stoking a fire hot enough to boil giant copper kettles. The air in the kitchen on a Monday would be thick with steam and the acrid smell of lye soap. The woman would stand for hours over a washboard, scrubbing heavy linens, wool, and cotton until her knuckles were raw. The soap was often homemade, a harsh mixture of animal fat and wood ash that stripped the skin of its oils. After scrubbing, the clothes had to be boiled, lifted out with heavy wooden tongs, rinsed in cold water, more hauling, and then wrung out by hand. Finally, they were hung on lines to dry, often freezing stiff in the winter wind. This labor was significant because it defined the economic value of the unmarried woman in a family. She wasn't just a mouth to feed, she was the engine that kept the household clean. In a time when disease was rampant and hygiene was a matter of life and death, the spinster aunt who spent her Mondays in a cloud of steam was actually a guardian of the family's health. She was essential. Her labor, though unpaid, was worth a fortune in today's currency. But her role went beyond physical labor. In many families, the unmarried aunt became the emotional anchor. Mothers in the 1800s were often exhausted by constant childbirth. The average woman bore 7 or 8 children. The maiden aunt, free from the physical toll of pregnancy, often had the energy and patience to be the primary caregiver for the older children. She was the one who taught them to read, who nursed them through measles and scarlet fever, and who told them stories. In fact, the 19th century saw a flowering of what we might call aunt literature. Think of the beloved Aunt March in Little Women, or Aunt Betsy Trotwood in David Copperfield. These figures were often stern on the outside, but fiercely protective on the inside. In real life, women like Mary Lyon, who founded Mount Holyoke College, or Catherine Beecher, who revolutionized women's education, were professional aunts to the nation. They channeled their maternal instincts not into a few biological children, but into thousands of students. However, there was another, far more mysterious realm where the unmarried woman found unexpected power in the mid to late 1800s, the spiritualist movement. It began in a small farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, in 1848. 2 young sisters, Kate and Maggie Fox, claimed they could communicate with the spirit of a dead peddler buried in their basement. They communicated through rappings, strange knockings on the walls and furniture. The phenomenon exploded. Within a few years, millions of Americans were holding seances in their parlors. Spiritualism was unique because it was a religion dominated by women. In the traditional church, women were expected to be silent. They couldn't preach or hold office. But in the seance room, the medium was the star. She was the vessel of the divine. And interestingly, many of the most famous mediums were unmarried women. Why? Perhaps because the role of a medium required a kind of passivity that fit the Victorian ideal of womanhood. She wasn't speaking her mind, she was letting a spirit speak through her. But in reality, this gave single women a public voice they never had before. A medium could stand on a stage in a trance and lecture an audience of men about abolition, women's rights, or temperance, claiming the words came from the spirit of Benjamin Franklin or an Indian chief. It was a brilliant, if unconscious, loophole in the patriarchy. Oxa W. Sprague is a perfect example. A spinster school teacher from Vermont fell ill with a joint disease that left her unable to walk. Doctors couldn't help her. Then she claimed spirits told her how to cure herself. She recovered and became a trance lecturer. She traveled the country alone, something unheard of for a single woman, speaking to packed halls. Because she was under the influence of spirits, no one could tell her to sit down or be quiet. She remained unmarried, financially independent, and famous until her death. This connection between single women and the unseen extended to healthcare as well. In rural communities, before the rise of the professional male doctor, the local healer was often an older, unmarried woman. She was the one who knew which roots cured a fever and which leaves stopped bleeding. She was the granny woman or the herb doctor. This knowledge was passed down orally.
But as the 19th century progressed, the medical establishment began to push these women out. The American Medical Association was founded in 1847, and it waged a war on irregular practitioners. States began passing laws that required medical licenses, which required a university education, something women were barred from. The wise woman was slowly replaced by the certified male physician. This was a tragedy for the single woman who lost a respected role in her community, and for the poor who could no longer afford the doctor's fees. Yet the unmarried woman found ways to fight back within the system. We must mention Elizabeth Blackwell. She was the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States. Admitted to Geneva Medical College in New York as a joke, the student body voted yes, thinking it was a prank. She graduated at the top of her class in 1849. Blackwell never married. She founded the New York Infirmary for indigent women and children, staffed entirely by women. She proved that a woman could hold the scalpel as steadily as a man. But let us return to the quiet, private moments of the single woman's life. How did she dress? How did she present herself to a world that considered her surplus? Fashion in the 1800s was a language. A married woman wore certain colors and caps. A widow wore black crepe. But the spinster, she was in a sartorial limbo. The stereotype was that she wore drab colors, browns, grays, and puce, and severe hairstyles. And to some extent, this was true. An unmarried woman was expected to be modest. She shouldn't attract attention. However, the old maid often had one advantage. She didn't have to ruin her body with constant childbearing. While her married sisters often looked aged and worn by 30, the single woman might retain her figure and her health well into middle age.
There was a saying in the 19th century, "Women are like flowers. The more children they bear, the faster they fade." The spinster, in a strange twist, became the preserved rose. This vitality allowed her to engage in the growing club movement of the 1880s and 90s. We mentioned cirrhosis earlier, but the sheer scale of this movement is hard to grasp. By 1890, there were thousands of women's clubs across America. They weren't just social gatherings, they were universities for women who had been denied an education. They studied history, geography, literature, and art. Imagine a Tuesday afternoon in a small town in Ohio. A group of 20 women gather in a parlor. Most are married, but the president is often Miss Miller, the retired school teacher. She calls the meeting to order. They are studying the Italian Renaissance. Miss Miller, who has never been to Italy, gives a lecture on Michelangelo. For these women, the club was a window to the world, and for the unmarried woman, it was a place where her intellect was valued above her fertility. But there was one group of unmarried women whose lives were far removed from the parlor or the lecture hall, the immigrant domestic servants. Between 1840 and 1900, millions of Irish, German, and Scandinavian immigrants arrived in America. A huge percentage of the Irish immigrants were single women. Unlike other groups who came as families, Irish girls often came alone. They were fleeing the potato famine and the crushing poverty of their homeland. They were called Bridgets by the American press, a derogatory term for the stereotypical Irish maid. A Bridget worked 16 hours a day. She lived in a small attic room in her employer's house. She cooked, cleaned, scrubbed floors, and minded children. She had almost no privacy. Her employer could search her trunk, read her mail, and dictate who she could see on her one day off. Yet the Irish domestic was a powerhouse of the American economy. Because she was single and lived in, meaning she had no rent or food expenses, she could save almost all her wages, and she sent that money home. It is estimated that in the 1850s and 60s, millions of dollars flowed from the attics of New York and Boston back to the cottages of Ireland, paying the rent for aging parents or buying tickets for siblings to come to America. The single Irish maid was the primary breadwinner for families across the ocean. Her life was lonely. The sign "No Irish Need Apply" was real. She faced prejudice for her religion, Catholicism, and her ethnicity, but she was also fiercely independent. If an employer mistreated her, she could pack her trunk and find a new job the same day. Good servants were always in demand. She didn't need a husband to survive in America. In fact, statistics show that Irish women in America married later and less frequently than any other group. They had tasted financial freedom, and they were in no hurry to give it up. As we look at these different lives, the spiritualist, the doctor, the club president, the Irish maid, we see a common thread. The unmarried woman was a disruptor. By simply existing outside the traditional family structure, she forced society to ask difficult questions. What is a woman for? Is she only a wife and mother, or is she a human being with her own destiny? And as the 19th century bled into the 20th, a new invention would arrive that would give the unmarried woman her greatest weapon yet, the telephone. In 1878, a year after Alexander Graham Bell's telephone began to appear in American cities, a manager at the Boston Telephone Dispatch Company made a decision that would inadvertently create one of the most iconic roles for the unmarried woman in history. Initially, The company had hired teenage boys to work the switchboards. It was a disaster. The boys were rude, they played pranks on the customers, and they wrestled on the floor during slow periods. In desperation, the manager fired the boys and hired a woman named Emma Nutt. She was patient, polite, and her voice was soothing. Within hours, the Hello Girl was born. For the unmarried woman of the late 19th century, the telephone exchange offered a job that was cleaner than the factory, more exciting than the classroom, and more modern than the dress shop. But it was not easy. Picture a room in 1890 filled with long wooden switchboards that looked like upright pianos covered in holes and wires. The air is hot and still, filled with the low hum of 100 female voices murmuring, "Number, please." A supervisor, usually a stern older woman, walks behind the chairs, tapping a pencil on the shoulder of anyone who slumps or speaks too loudly. The operator had to be single. This was a strict rule. The logic was that a married woman would be distracted by her home duties, whereas a single woman could give her entire devotion to the service. She sat on a high stool for hours, wearing a heavy headset that clamped over her hair, often ruining the fashionable pompadour style she had spent 20 minutes perfecting that morning. Her hands had to move with lightning speed, plugging brass jacks into the correct holes to connect a caller from Main Street to a doctor on the edge of town. But the telephone operator held a secret power. She was the gatekeeper of the community. In small towns, the operator knew everything. She knew who was calling whom. She knew when the doctor was summoned in the middle of the night, a birth, a death. She knew when the banker called the lawyer. She was the human internet of the Victorian age. And in emergencies, she was the hero. During floods or fires, operators often stayed at their posts while the water rose or the smoke thickened, frantically calling residents to warn them to evacuate. These heroines of the switchboard became a staple of newspaper stories, further elevating the status of the single working woman. Yet the telephone did something even more profound to the social life of the unmarried woman. It destroyed the walls of the parlor. For centuries, courtship had been a physical, supervised act. A man had to come to a woman's house, sit in her family's parlor, and talk to her under the watchful eye of a chaperone. The telephone changed the geometry of romance. Now a young man could call a young woman. They could speak privately, voice to voice, without anyone listening, unless the operator was eavesdropping, which, let's be honest, she often was. This disembodied intimacy was thrilling and terrifying to parents. It allowed a woman to have a private life, a secret self that was previously impossible. As the 1890s roared toward the new century, this desire for privacy and independence began to reshape the very architecture of the city. We see the rise of a new phenomenon, the bachelor girl apartment. Before this era, a respectable single woman lived with her family or in a boarding house. To live alone was to be loose. But in cities like New York and Chicago, a new type of housing began to appear, the apartment hotel. These were buildings designed for single professionals. They had small suites with no kitchens because dining was done in a communal hall or at restaurants, another radical idea for women. Imagine a young illustrator named Alice living in a studio in Greenwich Village in 1895. She has her own key. She comes and goes as she pleases. Her walls are decorated not with family portraits, but with Japanese fans and sketches from her art classes. She might invite a man to tea, alone. This was scandalous to her grandmother, but to Alice it was simply life. The bachelor girl was a media sensation. Magazines published articles like How to Live on $10 a Week or Chafing Dish Recipes for the Solitary Girl. The chafing dish, a portable cooking pot heated by an alcohol lamp, became the symbol of this new lifestyle. It meant you could cook a simple meal of Welsh rarebit or scrambled eggs in your room, independent of a boarding house landlady's schedule. But while the city offered apartments and telephones, the vast majority of single women still lived in rural America, and for them, the changes were slower but no less significant. The bicycle, which we touched on earlier, finally reached the farm. In 1895, the Sears Roebuck catalog offered bicycles for $15. Suddenly, a farm girl didn't need a horse and buggy to visit her friend 5 miles away. She could ride. And because skirts could get caught in the chain, she began to wear bloomers, baggy trousers gathered at the knee. This fashion shift was explosive. For the first time in Western history, women were wearing pants in public. The ridicule was intense. Cartoons mocked bloomer girls as smoking cigars and beating up their husbands. But the women didn't care. The sensation of speed, of wind in the face, of propelling oneself forward by one's own power was addictive. One elderly woman, looking back on the 1890s, said, "You cannot imagine what it meant to us. We had been sitting still for centuries. Suddenly, we were moving." This movement wasn't just physical, it was intellectual. The rise of the public library system in the late 1800s, spearheaded by philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie, was a godsend for the unmarried woman. In a small town, the library was often the only respectable public place a woman could go alone. It was warm, it was quiet, and it was free. Here, the spinster found her true companions, books. She could travel to the pyramids of Egypt, debate philosophy with the Greeks, or weep over the tragedies of Dickens, all while sitting in a wooden chair in Ohio. The library also provided jobs. Librarianship became a female-dominated profession, much like teaching. But unlike the teacher who dealt with unruly children, the librarian was the guardian of knowledge. She was the priestess of the book. It was a role that commanded a quiet intellectual respect. However, we must not forget the shadow that hung over all these advancements. The 19th century was also an era of immense health anxiety. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was the leading cause of death. It was a romanticized disease, often associated with the young and the beautiful, the fading flower. For the unmarried woman, falling ill was a catastrophe. Without a husband to support her, she was entirely dependent on her savings or her family. This fear drove many single women into the arms of the patent medicine industry. The newspapers were filled with advertisements for Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound or Dr. Pierce's favorite prescription, aimed specifically at female complaints. These tonics were often 20% alcohol or laced with opium. For a lonely, overworked woman suffering from menstrual pain or nerves, a spoonful of Lydia Pinkham was a socially acceptable way to numb the pain. In a sense, the teetotaling spinster aunt was often unwittingly an addict, soothing the harshness of her 19th century life with a bottle of medicine hidden in her wardrobe. As the final year of the century, 1899, arrived, the mood in America was electric. The Spanish-American War had just ended, establishing the U.S. as a global power. The economy was booming, and the woman question was no longer a question, it was a reality. In the universities, a new generation of women was graduating. These were the college girls. Vassar, Smith, Wellesley, and Bryn Mawr were turning out women who were not content to be mere ornaments. They were scientists, doctors, and sociologists. They looked at the institution of marriage with a skeptical eye. Statistics from the 1890s show that 50% of college-educated women never married. This was a staggering number. It suggested that for an educated woman, marriage was not a promotion, it was a demotion. Why? Because under the law, a wife still lost much of her autonomy. A husband could still dictate where they lived. He could still control her property in many states. He could still demand her obedience. For a woman who had tasted the intellectual freedom of the college seminar and the camaraderie of the dormitory, the prospect of becoming a housekeeper for a man who might be her intellectual inferior was simply not appealing. So they formed Boston marriages. They moved into settlement houses. They became career women. They were the first generation to openly declare that a woman's life could be complete without a man. One such woman was Alice Hamilton. Graduating from medical school in 1893, she didn't just become a doctor, she invented the field of industrial medicine. She went into the factories, the lead smelters, the paintworks, where men were dying of mysterious poisons. She climbed ladders, inspected vats of acid, and interviewed workers in their homes. She remained single her entire life. When asked about it, she simply said she was too busy. Her work saved thousands of lives. She lived to be 101, a testament to the endurance of the single woman. But as the fireworks exploded over New York Harbor on New Year's Eve, 1899, welcoming the 20th century, there was a sense that the fight was just beginning. The spinster, the old maid, the surplus woman, she was about to become the suffragette.
The dawn of the 20th century did not bring immediate liberation. Rather, it brought the simmering tensions of the last 100 years to a boiling point. The Victorian era, with its stifling parlors and rigid corsets, was officially dead. In its place stood the new woman, and she was no longer asking for permission. She was demanding power. And at the vanguard of this final, ferocious battle for the soul of America stood the unmarried woman. If the 1800s had been a century of silent endurance, of women surviving in sod houses, factories, and classrooms, the early 1900s became the era of public noise. The spinster, once a figure of pity hiding in the shadows, stepped into the bright, harsh light of the political street. She became the suffragette. It is impossible to overstate how critical single women were to the suffrage movement. Married women, legally tethered to their husbands and burdened with the relentless demands of childcare, often found it impossible to leave their homes for weeks at a time to march, robbie, or go to jail. But the single woman, she was dangerous precisely because she was free. She had no husband to forbid her from speaking. She had no children to be taken away by the state. She had only her conscience and her courage. Consider Susan B. Anthony, the general of this army. She had spent the entire 19th century, from the 1850s to her death in 1906, fighting for this moment. She never married, famously declaring that failure is impossible. She was mocked as a sexless, bitter old maid in the press. Cartoons depicted her as a man in a dress, wielding an umbrella like a weapon. But Anthony knew the truth. Her single status was her shield. It allowed her to travel across the country in blizzard conditions, sleeping in sleighs and eating dried bread, organizing women in every small town she visited. She was the aunt to the entire movement, mentoring a generation of younger women who would carry the torch. One of those young women was Alice Paul. If Anthony was the grandmother of the movement,
Alice Paul was its warrior. A Quaker from New Jersey, highly educated and fiercely single, Paul brought a new militant energy to the fight. She didn't want to ask politely for the vote. She wanted to force the government's hand. In 1913, she organized a massive parade in Washington, D.C., the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Thousands of women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. They were attacked by mobs of angry men who spat on them, slapped them, and burned them with cigars. The police stood by and watched.
But Alice Paul didn't retreat. She and her silent sentinels, many of them unmarried women with nothing to lose, began picketing the White House. This was unheard of. They stood at the gates in rain, sleet, and snow, holding banners that read, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" They were arrested. They were thrown into the Occoquan workhouse, a rat-infested prison. Inside, they were treated brutally. They were beaten, stripped, and thrown into dark cells. When they went on hunger strike to demand political prisoner status, they were force-fed. Doctors shoved rubber tubes down their throats and poured raw eggs into their stomachs, a torture that caused vomiting and bleeding. Alice Paul was committed to the psychiatric ward, where doctors tried to declare her insane. Her crime? Believing that women were equal to men. But the news of this brutality leaked out. The public, who had once laughed at the crazy spinsters, was now horrified. These women were not hysterical. They were heroes. The old maid stereotype was shattering. Here were women of iron will, women who were willing to die for a cause. The unmarried woman had proven that her lack of a husband did not make her weak. It made her unstoppable. Then came the Great War in 1917. World War I was the final catalyst. As millions of American men were shipped off to the trenches of France, the country faced a labor crisis. Who would build the ships? Who would make the ammunition? Who would run the trains? The answer, once again, was the unmarried woman. They flooded into the factories, but this time they wore overalls. They welded steel. They drove ambulances near the front lines, dodging mortar shells. They worked as hello girls in the Signal Corps, translating coded messages under fire. The argument that women were too fragile for political life evaporated in the smoke of the factories. If a single woman could build a bomb, surely she could cast a ballot. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified. It came down to a single vote in the Tennessee legislature, cast by a young man named Harry Byrne, who changed his vote from no to yes because he received a letter from his mother telling him to be a good boy. But the victory belonged to the thousands of nameless single women who had marched, starved, and organized for 70 years. As we look back from the vantage point of history, the transformation of the unmarried woman in the 19th century America is nothing short of miraculous. She began the century as a tragedy. In 1800, to be unmarried was to be a relic, a burden, a woman without a purpose. She was the aunt in the attic, the silent servant, the object of pity. She had no legal identity, no money of her own, and no voice. But she ended the century as a triumph. By 1900, she was the new woman. She was the homesteader who tamed the prairie. She was the nurse who revolutionized healthcare. She was the teacher who educated a nation. She was the writer who captured the American soul. She was the factory girl who built the industrial economy. And finally, she was the citizen who won the right to vote. The legacy of these surplus women is woven into the very fabric of modern life. Every time a woman today opens a bank account in her own name, she is standing on the shoulders of the spinsters who fought for the property acts.
Every time a woman goes to college, she walks in the footsteps of the Boston marriages who founded the women's colleges. Every time a woman casts a ballot, she hears the echo of Susan Anthony's gavel. They proved that a woman's worth is not determined by who she marries or if she marries at all. They proved that a life lived alone can be a life of immense richness, connection, and consequence. They redefined the word family to mean a community of friends and fellow travelers. They redefined home, not as a cage, but as a base of operations. In the end, the story of the unmarried woman in the 1800s is not a story of what was missing, a husband. It is a story of what was found, freedom. And so, as the sun sets on the 19th century, we leave the parlor for the last time. The lamp is blown out. The heavy velvet curtains are pulled back. Outside, the street is filled with bicycles, with typewriters, with voices. The silence is gone. The unmarried woman has spoken, and the world will never be the same again.